Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be getting into neurodiversity. You guys sent in some seriously thought-provoking stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm really particularly intrigued by this whole double empathy thing. Have you ever, I'm sure everyone has, but have you ever been in a conversation where you felt like you were just totally not understood?
Yeah.
Like you were speaking a different language?
Of course.
That's kind of what double empathy is getting at when it comes to neurotypical people interacting with autistic individuals.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy.
Yeah.
Because, Dr. Damian Milton, he's the one who actually coined that term, double empathy.
Yeah.
And he kind of challenges that traditional idea that it's autistic people who lack empathy. He's saying it's more like a two-way miscommunication where both neurotypical individuals and autistic individuals struggle to bridge that gap between their different communication styles.
Okay, so it's not just about one side needing to learn empathy. It's about recognizing that both sides might be missing cues, or like you said, interpreting things totally differently.
Exactly. And there's research that actually points to a more nuanced understanding of how these social interactions kind of work. And one of the articles that you shared uses the example of two different cultures trying to communicate. Each culture will have its own social norms and its own ways of expressing themselves. And so oftentimes you run into these misunderstandings that both sides are contributing to.
That makes a lot of sense. And it really highlights just how important it is to be building more inclusive environments. Environments where those different ways of communicating and interacting are both understood and valued. But before we get too far down that road, let's talk about autism itself for a second. One thing that really struck me from the stuff that you shared is that autism is a spectrum, meaning it shows up in tons of different ways.
Absolutely. We often hear these stereotypes, but the reality is that no two autistic individuals experience autism the exact same way.
Right.
And assuming that everyone on the spectrum fits a certain mold can be incredibly damaging.
So this common misconception that all autistic people lack social skills or emotional depth, that's not the full picture, is it?
Not at all. In fact, one of the articles you sent me actually talked about the concept of masking. And this is where autistic individuals learn to suppress their natural behaviors to fit in with neurotypical expectations.
So they're essentially putting on a performance all the time, just to navigate a world that wasn't designed with their neurology in mind.
Precisely. And while masking might seem helpful on the surface, it can be incredibly draining.
Yeah.
And can actually lead to some mental health challenges as well.
The article mentioned that this constant pressure to conform can be really exhausting and even lead to things like anxiety and depression for some people, which is just heartbreaking, to think that someone might feel pressure to hide who they are just to be accepted. And this masking thing actually ties back into the double empathy problem, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Because if someone is masking, it becomes even harder for neurotypical individuals to understand the challenges they might be facing beneath the surface.
Wow. So it's like a vicious cycle in a way. And it makes you realize how important it is to kind of question those assumptions that we make about people based on outward appearances or behaviors.
Right.
And it also makes you think about the definition of success, right? And how that can sometimes be used to marginalize neurodivergent individuals.
Yeah.
Just because someone doesn't thrive in a really traditional environment doesn't mean that they aren't brilliant or capable in their own way.
Exactly. And that actually leads us into that broader concept of neuroism that you had highlighted in your notes.
Right.
Which is basically taking this conversation beyond just autism to encompass that kind of systemic bias against anyone with neurological differences. Wow.
So we're talking about people with ADHD, dyslexia, you name it. If your brain works differently than what's considered typical, you might find yourself running up against these biases. Wow, so it's not even just about one diagnosis, it's like a whole system of thinking about how we value different minds.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of what this neuroism actually looks like in the real world?
Absolutely. Think about the education system. You'd send over an article that highlighted how many schools are just ill-equipped to properly support neurodivergent learners. And it's not always necessarily about a lack of resources.
Right.
Although that is certainly a factor, sometimes it's a fundamental lack of understanding of how different minds learn best.
It's like we're trying to force everyone to fit into the same mold, even though our brains are literally wired so differently.
Precisely. And that this can lead to kids feeling like they're failing.
Right.
When really the system is failing them because they might be told that they're lazy or that they're not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
When in reality, they just need different approaches to learning.
This makes me think about some of the research you shared about workplace challenges, too. It's like we design workplaces with a very specific type of neurology in mind. And if you don't fit that mold, you're seen as somehow less than.
Yeah, and this can manifest in so many subtle ways, from the interview process itself to how work is structured, even down to the office environment. One of the articles you sent actually mentioned the challenges that neurodivergent individuals can face with sensory overload in like those open plan offices, for example.
Oh, totally, yeah. You've got those bright fluorescent lights, the constant chatter, lack of personal space.
Mm,
I can totally see how that would be really difficult for someone with sensory sensitivities.
exactly. And then on top of that, you have things like traditional performance reviews, which might not take into account the different ways that neurodivergent individuals process information or communicate their ideas.
It feels like we often focus on someone's weaknesses
Hmm.
or what they're not good at,
Right.
rather than celebrating their unique strengths and talents.
That's such a good point. Because when we define success solely by these very traditional metrics, like climbing the corporate ladder or excelling in a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, we miss out on the incredible contributions that neurodivergent individuals can make when their strengths are recognized and nurtured.
So much of this feels like it comes down to creating more inclusive environments, where those differences are not only like accepted, but actually celebrated.
Absolutely. And that goes beyond just the workplace or the education system.
Hmm.
We also need to consider that like social dimension of neuroism.
Right.
You mentioned feeling isolated or misunderstood in conversations sometimes. Just imagine experiencing that on a daily basis.
Yeah, that constant feeling of being out of sync with everyone else must be so isolating.
It can be incredibly damaging to someone's sense of self-worth and belonging. They might start to withdraw from social situations altogether, which further exacerbates those feelings of loneliness and isolation.
Feels like we're saying you don't belong here just because their brain works a little differently.
And that's the thing, that's exactly the kind of systemic bias we need to be dismantling. And you shared some really powerful research on this. It's clear that combating neuroism, it takes a multifaceted approach.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Like, how do we do that?
Well, I think recognizing those more subtle ways that neuroism kind of creeps into our everyday lives, it's not always about like overt discrimination. Sometimes it's the things we don't do. The ways we maybe unknowingly exclude neurodivergent individuals.
Can you give me some examples? Because I think sometimes people hear discrimination and they think like really intentional, acts of hate or whatever.
Yeah.
But neuroism, it can be a lot more insidious than that, right?
Absolutely. Like one example is exclusion. Have you ever noticed someone consistently being left out of social gatherings or work events? Like maybe they're never invited to lunch with coworkers, or they always seem to be on the periphery of group conversations.
Yeah, and I bet sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it. It's not like intentional malice or anything.
Exactly. It can be unconscious bias. People just naturally gravitate toward those who are most like them without even realizing it. And that's why awareness is so, so key.
Okay, so exclusion, that's a big one. What else? What are some other ways that we might not even pick up on?
Pay attention to the language that's used to describe neurodivergent individuals. Are people using like negative stereotypes or terms that reinforce the idea that there's something wrong with being neurodivergent? One of the articles you shared talked about using person-first language, so person with autism rather than autistic person.
Right, so instead of saying, oh, he's a little slow, it's like he might need a little more time to process information.
Exactly.
It's kind of shifting our language to be a little more understanding and a little less judgmental.
Precisely. And it might seem like a small thing, but words really do matter. They shape our perceptions, and they can either reinforce those negative stereotypes or help create a more inclusive and respectful environment.
Totally. Okay, so exclusion, language, what else? We're getting into like how to be a better human territory, and I am here for it.
Another key area is just being mindful of the support and accommodations we offer, or fail to offer, I should say, to neurodivergent individuals. So in a school setting, this might look like refusing to provide extra time on tests, or a quiet space for a student who gets overwhelmed by sensory overload. In the workplace, it could be a reluctance to adjust work schedules or provide assistive technology for an employee who needs it to thrive.
And again, I bet a lot of this comes down to just like lack of awareness, not understanding.
Absolutely. And that's why education is so crucial. We need to actively seek out information about neurodiversity, challenge our own biases, and be open to learning from the experiences of neurodivergent individuals.
One of the things I thought was really interesting from the stuff you shared was this idea of listening to neurodivergent voices.
Mm.
Like, we need to make space for them to feel safe to share their experiences, their perspectives.
Absolutely. We need more diverse representation in discussions about mental health, neurodiversity, disability justice. Hearing directly from neurodivergent people about their challenges and their triumphs is essential if we're going to create these truly inclusive environments.
It's like recognizing that the way we've always done things might not work for everyone and being open to changing those systems and structures to be more supportive.
Exactly. It's about moving away from this idea of a one-size-fits-all approach
All
and
right.
embracing those unique strengths and talents that neurodivergent individuals bring to the table.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It feels like we've only just kind of like scratched the surface of this topic. But for our listeners out there who are maybe feeling inspired, want to learn more, be better allies, what are some things people can do?
Start by educating yourself. Read books and articles written by neurodivergent authors. Listen to podcasts that are hosted by neurodivergent people. Follow neurodiversity advocates on social media. The more you immerse yourself in these perspectives, the more you'll start to understand the nuances of neurodiversity and how you can be an ally.
And don't be afraid to ask questions,
Right.
right? But like, do it respectfully,
Of course.
with a genuine desire to learn.
Absolutely. Approach those conversations with humility and be mindful of the power dynamics at play. Remember that neurodivergent people are not responsible for educating you, but they might be willing to share their experiences if you approach them with respect and an open mind.
Another thing that I thought was really important was this idea of using your voice to advocate for change. We can't just sit back and wait for things to get better. We have to actively challenge neuroism wherever we see it.
Absolutely. And that might mean speaking up when you hear someone using harmful language, or advocating for more inclusive policies at your workplace, or even just supporting organizations that are working to create a more equitable world for neurodivergent individuals.
It's about realizing that even if it's a small action, it can make a difference,
Yeah.
and that we all have a part to play in creating a more just and inclusive world.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Creating a world where neurodiversity is not just accepted, but celebrated. That's something worth striving for.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today, everyone. We hope you learned something new, and we'll see you next time.